So if God is dyslexic, is he a wild old dog? Well, you've just heard one of the most beautiful songs I've ever heard. Actually, I was just thinking about the first time I heard it. I was driving down to Galveston. Erin, my wife, was working down there, and Patty had just written this. My dad was struggling with Alzheimer's, and it really just struck me because it follows another song that she opens that album with, American Kid, which is all about, it's a love song to her father who's passed away. But I immediately started thinking about God as a wild old dog. And that was years ago, but this sermon has come out of that. That song's heart-wrenching, as much of Patty Griffin's music is. And she wrote it in response to a stark realization. She was driving one evening back from Nashville at sunset, and about halfway between Austin and Nashville, and of course she's from, or lives here, and maybe is here right now. I don't know. Patty, you're here. Hi. But she saw a dog running out down the hallway in tall grasses out ahead of her. First, she thought it was exceptionally beautiful, that dog out in front of the sunset. And then she was shocked because she realized that its owners had abandoned it, that she was just too far from anywhere. And then she thought about how often this does occur when people don't know what to do with their pets. And she wrote that song. To me, Griffin's complex voice and her lyrics show the way the divine and the sacred are intermixed into our everyday lives. If only we have the eyes to see it. But isn't that the question? Because who really has the eyes to see it? Do you? Do I? At least Griffin did, if only for a passing glimpse, just long enough to write that song. And that's the question I pose for us today. Who can see God in a wild old dog? Much of the time, we here in the UU find God language off-putting. At times, I certainly do. And my first seminary year, which I've just finished, underscored this. Attending a Presbyterian seminary in Texas as a UU, this year taught me all too well how frequently we humans work too hard to make God small, or put differently, to box God. By boxing God, I mean two things, which I think we all do to some extent, no matter where we stand on God language. Many of us who find meaning in the term God try to do something impossible, and we try to articulate the ineffable. And every time we utter our definition or our articulation of God, we then step back and we realize that we've just tended to make God smaller than any living spirit or energy or ghostly view of reality possibly could. On the other hand, those of us who don't find God language meaningful all too often do something completely different. Instead of trying to stuff God in a box, we tend to put on our boxing gloves and step right into the ring. So whomever we are, both our theological and our atheological constructions tend to limit our ability to articulate the sacred. And ultimately, I think this does all of us and all of our species on this planet real harm. But before I get to that, let's tackle Patty Griffin's and our own God language. And I'll share, to start, some of my reflections on a year in seminary, and they kind of inspired the call to worship and the readings we just had. I didn't read Pema Chodron in seminary, but I do read a lot of Pema Chodron. But the others I did read, I read Acts, and I read Gilead by Marilyn Robinson, which is a brilliant theological tour de force by a Calvinist theologian. If by God you are describing some sort of powerful force that has volition and will and is in control of things, as so much of Judeo-Christianity and Islam does, well, you've kind of lost me. It seems pretty clear these days that the operating mechanism of evolution is random mutation. And this is such an intellectual and theological revolution for Western thought that it is no surprise that Charles Darwin himself, who was himself studying to be a Unitarian Universalist, no, not quite that, but Unitarian minister, He waited 30 years to publish his findings because of that. His father, Erasmus Darwin, apparently said that Unitarian Christianity is a featherbed for a falling Christian. He also was a Unitarian minister. The ripplings into theology that Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace's discoveries and the whole resultant field of genetics have come to is something that our religions are still suffering serious seismic aftershocks from. It's going to take us centuries to reorient into this world. They have poked very large holes into previous fables that meaningfully explain where we had come from and where we were going. Okay. But if by God you mean the revelation of a particularly loving man in the Middle East 2,000 years ago, well, it turns out that after a year at a Christian seminary, you do actually have my interest. And I'm really pleased to have spent that year reliving this one story. For I am very taken, if not completely captivated by love. It's the most beautiful thing in the world. Love is what I've experienced from birth from my parents, siblings, my spouse, and a few very close friends. And it is what I hear in every note of Patty Griffin's voice. If you up the ante and then start talking about unconditional love, well, then you have my undivided attention. It's a squirmy term, unconditional love, but on occasion I have experienced from a couple people in my life, mostly my parents, but also my spouse at times and my siblings, what I would call unconditional love. That was acceptance of who I was no matter what. And I'll tell you, it felt better than anything. Those have been the most transformative relationships of my life, and I imagine they have been for you too. Have you ever had someone love you unconditionally? Perhaps a parent or a partner or a child. So, imagining a God, a deity that loves like that is indeed what I would call worthwhile. And to a wonderful extent, that is much of who God is in Christianity, and a deity who simply just loves unconditionally. And yet, Christian theology so rarely holds to the rails of unconditional love. So often it hops the tracks. Because if you intend by your word God to mean the exclusive revelation of one man, of unconditional love through one man in history, and only one man, as almost every theologian I studied this year does, then you've utterly lost me. What is even clearer to me than random mutation is the reality that a God who loves unconditionally would not discriminate among religions to find one more superior than others. Yet this is predominantly how Christianity has articulated itself ever since the 4th century. But do remember that there were 3 centuries before that, and many Christianities. So, God language can be problematic. And to review so far, for me, these problems significantly hinge on 2 articulations, those of God's will or volition, and those of God's exclusivity. Each of these articulations make God small, and in doing so, they do a lot of harm, as any hospital chaplain can tell you after trying to explain God's role in a child's death to a grieving family, as I had to at 1:30 in the morning last Monday to a baby that had lived for an hour, having been born for 31 weeks. In Spanish. Or any indigenous person could tell you after experiencing Western colonialism. But godless language, now, how much better does it do? Religious fundamentalisms have led so many of us, especially here in the UU, into the trenches of a reactionary and scientific fundamentalism of our own. There are many atheisms. The new atheism, one particularly recent vintage, has taken as its mission to curing the ignorance of religious people, as if that would fix all the ills of the world. Yet it has replaced this with an ignorance all its own, a willful ignorance of the good works that so many people do daily in the name of their spiritual traditions, and an ignorance that can be as condescending and as exclusionary as colonial Christianity has been. The vintage of atheism that I'm talking about here involves both a misunderstanding of science and a misunderstanding of people. As many a professional scientist will tell you, scientists are among the most reverent people out there. It's their very curiosity and respect for life and the workings of the universe amidst so much unknowing that motivates them. They are usually filled with wonder no different than many a Benedictine mystic. So if by atheos or godlessness you mean that the world is meaningless, as many a postmodern philosopher wondered, simply because it has no anthropomorphized architect, then you have similarly lost me. For meaning is made in all kinds of ways through all kinds of narratives. Or if you mean by atheism that you have arrived at a certainty about the world, you have especially lost me. For as a scientist knows, science works in probabilities, not certainties. And as Pema Chodron said in our reading just now, certainty is certainly doing harm to the world, for it belies a lack of compassion and love. But if in your atheos you actually mean that much is sacred to you, as science describes it, but are offended at how other religions have inaccurately depicted theos, then you have my attention. Perhaps you are reverent toward nature. Perhaps you are reverent toward culture. Perhaps towards humanity. If you can recognize reverence, then you can probably recognize that you are reverent just like religious people. You will see you have something in common with them. For all of us revere something, whether we are an atheist, an agnostic, a pagan, a humanist, a Christian, a Sufi, or a Muslim circling the Kaaba on the Hajj. In reality, many of the most irreverent people I know are, when I look carefully, the most reverent. Many of them are my best friends. They just aren't making it so easy to see. They're spicing it up, giving their reverence some flavor. For instance, my good friend Alex swears irreverently all the time. You F's is often how he describes people. And you have no idea, unless you hear his tone, what he means by that. He may be angry, or he may be deeply loving, or he may be both simultaneously. Regardless, he has reverence for whoever the object of UFs is, and it is incumbent on the listener to translate his reverence or his love. You have to get to know Alex to know what he means by it. You have to get to know how much he's been through, that he was born Elizabeth, grew up a fundamentalist Christian, fell in love with a woman, and was disowned by his parents. You have to know how carefully he walked his path, and with how much love he loves all of the fucks in his life. You have to see between the lines. You have to look at the many bands of light that color our black and white perceptions of the world. And you have to do some translating. In the end, all of us have to do some translating with love and humility. For our Christian brothers and sisters, this is the season of Pentecost. It was about a month ago, and it lasts really long. And just like the early Christians on the morning of Pentecost, we need to break down our God talk, especially here in the UU, and see it for what it is, language that struggles and ultimately fails to speak about things that escape our conceptual grasp. We need to see that we come from different cultures, each with our own languages, much less dialects, even here in Austin. And we need to work to see the complexities we each express. For me, I'm a mystic, for I am reverent toward much that is out there, and I feel this reverence emotionally through an experience. But I also have to confess my atheism, because I don't think there is a volitional God out there. In fact, I'd say I have a 95% confidence interval that there is not. And in my language, in my culture, theos means a deity with a will that directs. But is that all theos can mean? No. And do I really know it? No. So I must confess my agnosticism, my agnosia, as unsettling and humbling as that is. So by all means, let's avoid certainty when it comes to human spirituality, and let's learn to live with uncertain reverence. Let's find, as Pema Chodron said, the middle way, an open state of mind that can relax with paradox and ambiguity. This is one of the main points that I think we in the UU need to drive home in our increasingly polarized society. Our divisions within our faith have mirrored those in our political world. Just like out there, red won't talk to blue, and here, theist so frequently has a hard time talking to atheist and vice versa. Whichever side we are on, we argue with the other side and we try to come up with proofs. And as our reading from Gilead pointed out, we are profoundly unsettled when we try to claim for God something within our conceptual grasp. Perhaps many of you are like me and have been scarred, if not frankly shattered, by Christian fundamentalism. So it's no surprise that we found the UU, a place where we profess to love each other unconditionally in respect to religious belief and principle. But I really wonder, do we come close to actually doing it? Perhaps we can take Chodron's middle way and stop suffering from resolution. There we will find the love that binds us together, be it a loving atheism or a loving theism. So I return to my initial question. Who has such eyes to see the permeation of the sacred through all reality, even amidst the profane? Or, as Griffin puts it, who among us can see God in the least of us, even a dog left out on the highway? I believe all of us can, theist and atheist, Christian and pagan, Buddhist and Jew, agnostic and devout member of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, which may be my favorite church. It just takes humility. It takes those of us who are scientists to recognize that we are human and may be wrong. It takes those of us who are religious or are not to recognize that we are boxing God. I returned to the God in that old wild dog that Patty saw along the highway and told us about with such an incredible voice that somehow Annabeth is able to mimic and recreate. Patty's voice constantly evokes a sense of humility and the reverence that stems from it. We think of her music as depressing or melancholic, and it indeed can be. But what her voice does better than any voice I have ever heard is blend the sadness of life with a sense of growth and journey amidst a love for all things. In Buddhism and Hinduism, this is called samsara, the sadness of human life. What the Shambhala teacher Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche often called the tender heart or the genuine heart of sadness. It requires an open heart. Uncertain reverence results from a humble appreciation of what we are and are not capable of. Patty Griffin grew up Catholic, but left it for most of her life. She, like many of us, was offended by the ways in which her Catholicism boxed God. Griffin nonetheless wrote some incredible songs about religion in these years. Mary from her second album, Up to the Mountain about the Martin Luther King speech, and one of the most reverent songs ever, Heavenly Day, which was a love song to, yep, you guessed it, her dog. Although it's often played at weddings. However, it was not until doing her first gospel album that she began to return to the church. In 2010, when she put out that first gospel album, which was entitled Downtown Church, well, she won her first Grammy and was #1 on the Billboard Christian charts, which I just thought was wonderfully ironic. But not so much. In an interview with NPR, she told them, quote, that she was working out some complicated feelings about religion. Well, that sounds about right, doesn't it? Working out some complicated feelings about religion. I don't know about you, but for me, heading to the UU for the first time was about exactly that, working out some complicated feelings about religion. I really wish we could just shatter the fundamentalisms that we hold. Like panes of glass, can't we just take our hates, whatever they are, our judgments, whatever they are, and throw them against the concrete? And then couldn't we see what remains in the plainness of daylight? For in those shards of glass, I think we would see light refracting into rainbows. Instead of dualisms, I think we'd see the beauty of diversity, religious spectra, gender spectra, sexuality spectra, spectra of genetic biodiversity, and spectra of cultural meaning. There, amidst those shards, I think we'd see love, and I think we'd see our reverence. And as we would move forward, we would have to walk uncertainly, for we'd be barefoot and vulnerable. But if we're lucky, One of those shards would lodge itself into the bottom of our foot, keeping us from forgetting our reverence and helping us to shine in a different way. So are you working out some complicated feelings about religion? If so, welcome home. Next, or in a minute, during our offering, we'll hear Annabeth sing Patty's most recent recorded song, Shine a Different Way. After her gospel album, her next album, American Kid, featured Wild Old Dog. But her most recent album, Servant of Love, concludes with this song and with these lyrics, which I'll read the last verse of. I'm going to let it be the sun in more ways than one, run out of its horizon. I'm going to let it be the night, for I have had my day dancing at the back door. I'm going to let it hear the prayer, no matter who is there, no matter who is listening. I'm going to let the dream tell me what it has always known, the moonlight and the glistening waves. So let's both unbox God and let's unbox godlessness. Let's let an uncertain reverence out. And as Patty says, let's let the rusty nail no longer hold the world together. Let's let reverence not only be an old wild dog, but let it be the sun in more ways than one, unexclusively. Let's let it run out of its horizon. Let's let reverence be the night. Let's let it hear the prayer, no matter who is there, no matter who is listening. And now we will turn to our hymnal and sing hymn number 108, My Life Flows On, an Endless Song.